And the creator of the People Building Better Cities exhibition, which I think some of you got a chance to look at as you came through. And if you didn't get a chance to look at it, perhaps you can have another look later. So I put up the front page of our website so that you know that there is a website of People Building Better Cities. And as you can see that PBBC Ann Arbor, this is the 20th time we have shown this exhibition. So it's been on a long trip around the world. It started in Bangkok in February, March 2013, and has been in a lot of cities in a lot of countries. 10 countries, and I think 18 cities. Melbourne had a repeat performance, and so did Chennai. They found it useful and they took it back again. So what I wanted to do was to just act as to introduce this session tonight and to tell you how we want to do it. We do have one of our speakers not quite with us yet, but no doubt she will come soon. And to introduce with a few remarks this roundtable. And our roundtable topic is how can Michigan cities be more inclusive and resilient? Now, I'm sure these are words that you're hearing a lot these days. And I wanted also to introduce you briefly to our speakers. Mitch McEwen, architect who is based in Detroit, but also teaches here at UMich. Peter Hammer, who's a lawyer, heads up the Damon Keith Centre of Civil Rights. And in order that we don't have to spend a lot of time about all these people with their huge accomplishments, that's why you have a sheet, and the sheet tells you a lot about them. Then we have David Scobey, who is an educator. He is here at the University of Michigan, but fairly recently ex-Parsons, New York. Mary Morgan is what I've called a civic activist. I hope she likes the description, and is based here in Ann Arbor. And lastly, Andy Newman, who's an anthropologist from Wayne State University. And in putting together this, we were very keen to try and sort of do a local program for people building better cities. Everywhere we've done it, we've tried to take out some of the big issues that appear in this exhibition and to ask people if they could have a useful conversation that bears on things that they're interested in. So in putting this together, I was really keen to try and do what I've called town and gown. So that's why we wanted Mary, who represents the town in this instance, the gown of the university, the academics, but then not only Ann Arbor, but also Detroit. So we have a mixture of Wayne State University, University of Michigan, and local people from the city. So before we go on to this, I realise that there's quite a large social work class that's here today, and thanks for coming. And I understand this is going to be an ongoing discussion for you. So I wanted to just give you a little sort of bit into some of this exhibition, which is called People Building Cities. And the premise of it has been that resilient, equitable, inclusive, smart and sustainable cities require citizen involvement. So that's been the underlying theme, the theme of engagement. We developed over time a set of tools, a toolkit if you like, about how you might do this. And I always say that the most important ones are probably the listening up top and the trust down the bottom. All the others, you can do them in any order you like. You could probably think of others. But when you're talking about this question of engagement, and I hope maybe some of our speakers might think about, we'll probably touch on some of these as well, that this question about listening and trust is so important. And I was just saying to Peter before, as we were looking around, there's absolutely no reason why anybody you go to meet with in any community should trust you. That's what I always say to the people that we work with. And over the years, I've worked with 600 people from 66 universities, including this one, 35 countries, and that's the statement I would always say, that there's no reason for anybody to trust you. You've got to earn that trust. So if you look out on these pages, and I'm not going to go into this, some of the big picture issues we're picking up on is climate change, we're picking up on inequality, we're picking up on the inclusive city, we're picking up on citizen engagement and public participation. All of that is out on those panels, and all of that is accessible if you want to follow it up. One of the inspirers to me of this project, a very wonderful Thai woman, Sumsuk Bunyabacha, always says, let people be the solution. For so long people have been patronised, have been told what to do, have been given money, have been, or programs devised for them. She's very straightforward about it. She says people know what they want and let them be the solution. Now, in order to just sort of put this into a bigger picture, I wanted to just briefly introduce you to, if you don't already know, the Sustainable Development Goals. These have just been ratified in September this year. This is the global framework for sustainable development through 2030. The project you see out on the wall was actually, its impetus came from my being involved with the Millennium Development Goals, and that's what got me going on that project. Now this is a new set of goals, many of them the same, many of them are refined, but I'd like to just draw your attention to one that's really important since we're talking about cities. Look at number 11 and Sustainable Cities and Communities. Goal 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, says make cities inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. And while we see a picture here of a refugee camp in Gaza, I don't think there's any reason why we shouldn't be thinking about what do these words mean here in Ann Arbor? What do these words mean in Detroit? What do they mean anywhere? So again, the other big picture framework that we're talking about is UN Habitat. And UN Habitat is a major player in the urban conversation. Next year in Quito, in October 2016, there will be a major meeting and it will be talking about housing and sustainable urban development. I have here on the table some papers that Doug Kelbar brought to my attention, and that's about the importance of public places, and he's been on a small group looking at what should go into making public places sustainable. And so there's a number of those. I'd like you to pick them up, and I'm hoping Doug will make some intervention at some point in our discussions. But the whole question about how public space is so absolutely incredibly crucial to the notion of inclusion and resilience. And I just wanted to not forget about the idea about art. I heard about this on the radio today. Maybe you all know it. But there's a woman called Ana Teresa Fernandez who has been painting the wall between the wall that stops people crossing the border at Tijuana. And there she was, painting it sky blue to actually erase it. So here you get this wonderful sort of symbolic sort of notion, and suddenly this wall, which is this impediment, through an artistic project, it is erased. Again, in our own work, a really nasty, brutal, concrete fence, and these guys started to paint it. And this, on the bottom part of this slide, became a major art project, a project that had 200 people involved in it who wrote a poem, and that poem is woven through these art projects. And this was a major reclamation of public space and, you could say, a declaration of freedom in a very poor township. And I just wanted to finish my brief remarks to say that there's the art and then there's the politics. And I am particularly inspired by this recent event, which is Agenda. Agenda is a Dutch group that won a law case in June when 900 plaintiffs were victorious in a claim against the Dutch government at a case held in The Hague. And when they claimed that the Dutch government was not doing enough to protect its citizens from climate change. And they won. Now, I think that's pretty amazing. And we could well argue the same sort of case here. So I'm also quite inspired by Pope Francis, who talks also about things like to change everything, we need everyone. And also Juan Clos, who heads up Habitat, who says our struggle for global sustainability will be lost in the cities. So now let's turn to our topic. How can Michigan cities be more inclusive and resilient? Now, I'm really thrilled to have such a diverse lot of people. And I saw Mitch walk in. Did she walk in? Yes, there she is. Anyway, so this is the order that I thought would be an interesting sort of order. When you get people from different disciplines, and I would guess all of the work that I have done and have always thought about is that you must have people from different disciplines, different perspectives, talking about these issues. They are so big, so complicated, no one person can really think them through. So Mitch is an architect from Detroit, and also we're teaching here at the university. So I'm now going to hand over to Mitch, and she is going to come up here, and her presentation is on the desktop, and I hope I can get out of mine to let her get into hers. Okay, Mitch. Yep.
Will you remind me how many minutes are we?
Oh, about 9. Okay. Yeah, and just to tell you a little bit about the format, the idea was that we would do, we've got 5 speakers, about 8 to 9 minutes each. We would finish that about 7, a bit after 7. Then we would open it up for discussion, and we really want to hear what you think about these issues and what other themes that you would bring in. And then we'll wrap it up at about 7:25 and see if each of the speakers would like to have one last word. We would like it to be as fiery as possible and as, as interesting as possible. So here, handing over to Mitch. You fine?
Yeah, I'm trying to do full screen.
Yeah.
No, it's I should know the short. Oh, okay.
You're a Mac person too, right?
Oh yeah, of course. Okay, control. Oh, thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, I really appreciate being invited here, and I love what Dr. Rubbo is doing with the people building better cities and this kind of global connection. I think a lot of times, those of us working on urbanism are attempting to kind of discover alternatives, and it's so great to have means of connecting different practices. So I'm going to show a little bit of what I'm doing in Detroit, and at the same time, I want to voice a little bit of, well, I like the urgency. I want to voice a little bit of both skepticism and urgency, which doesn't usually go together very well. But I think the idea of inclusion, I want to hesitate on that, because I feel like it sort of presumes already that those of us practicing and leading are maybe not the same as those of us who are inhabiting and participating, right? So, of course, if those of us who are sort of setting the agenda are not kind of either empathizing with or living with or inhabiting the same kind of realities as those of us who are inhabiting the cities, then there is perhaps the need for a kind of extension or inclusion, right? But if we imagine a world in which we haven't had the kind of legacies of, say, colonization or white supremacy or, different kind of institutionalized kind of artifacts of governance and property, and, if all of this were kind of cut through, then maybe what we would be talking about is not so much how do we include others, but maybe just how we practice. So in that, I'm just going to sort of assume that we're already there. And that in a way, what we are practicing is maybe a kind of urgency. And I like this kind of typo that's in the text for today, that we want to be kind of sooner rather than later, as if like even in wanting to be sooner, there's a kind of sequence, so both the then and the than. So that's kind of where I'm going to enter. This is the site for a project that I'm working on in Detroit, which is it's sort of commissioned by the U.S. Pavilion for the Venice Architecture Biennale for 2016, and Detroit is a kind of place that the U.S. Pavilion is treating not as a laboratory, not as a blank slate, but very much as a place of engagement where architecture can really just imagine within the realm of what's real, so that in a way imagination and reality can meet each other. That's the goal. So this site is in a very it's a very odd situation where you have all this industry. Here, what I'm mapping, because you're not architects, let me not get into that. What I'm mapping, in a way, is sort of the amazing publicness of Detroit. So all the gray is all the public-owned property, and then all the red are these kind of dots of demolitions and brownfields, what gets marked as brownfields, which is what happens after a site is demolished. So I'm really looking at Detroit And this is the entire city kind of mapped that way in terms of public ownership and where there's a kind of low-scale residential. It's a city that has this a fabric that's really extensive, over 139 square miles. It's mostly kind of single-family homes spaced out. And in terms of the processes, the kind of sooner rather than that's happening, it's really one of erasure, which is in a way a kind of typical urban situation. In the United States, a building's lifespan right now is only about 50 years. So we think about buildings as permanent, but actually the way that cities, the kind of morphology of cities is actually one that's constantly kind of replacing, supplanting, building, demolishing, subtracting, and then adding. So in this way, this is looking at the area that we looked at in the first slide, but looking at it really just in terms of kind of public processes and processes of subtraction. So if we're going to build better cities, I think it's sort of entering those processes. I'm just going to show you one project of mine. I'm giving this as if it's a 6-minute presentation. I'm sorry, I'm going a little bit fast. So this is a house in Detroit where basically I acquired this over the public auction as a kind of a way to enter into these processes in Detroit a few years ago before I had moved to Detroit. I wanted to sort of find a way of seeing these processes from the inside. So I purchased this house for $1,200 on the foreclosure auctions that happened through Wayne County, which is possibly the largest foreclosure auction on the planet. And I wanted to see how can architecture in a kind of expanded sense, I was working with artists, architecture in an expanded sense where there's no client, where there is a site, but not a given program. Program is usually kind of the task that we're given as designers. So I worked with some artists, a kind of black arts collective that inhabits different cities around the country, to look at what this house might be. And what we started to postulate is that it might be a space for performance. And so this is last summer. This is the first phase, where I was really looking at how can design inhabit that process of subtraction, the same way that we think about design as always wanting to build. And we know in a kind of carbon footprint sense, like we know that these kind of incessant processes have a major impact. So I wanted to look at how can I kind of achieve this very ambitious goal of opening this house up to be a space of theater and performance. It's called the House Opera, but at the same time really inhabit that kind of process of dealing with the existing reality, the existing built fabric, the vacant house, and just subtract. So what you're looking at is the part of the floor subtracted, and I'm kind of using that term because Keller Easterling I find to be very smart about these things, and she has a text called Extra Statecraft, talking about infrastructure, and also a little book called Subtraction, which is really looking at how can urban design and architecture really inhabit processes of subtracting. So this is looking at it's a balloon frame house, which means that it was built before industrialized timber, so you have these really long members that go sort of 24 feet up. So when you cut out the floor, the wall is still standing there. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but not much more complicated than that. So really just sort of taking the standard worker's house from early 1900s, actually even 1898, and just sort of cutting it away to make it do something else that the city needs maybe more than another house to go on the auction right now. So I worked with the local curator to program this, and the local curator launched this festival called Siggy Fest, which involved music, people dancing, and really the process that I've sort of entered into in design is how can design open up an imaginative space that other people can occupy, right? So rather than the kind of architect attempting to be the author of the entire society, which is maybe what the kind of utopian visions of the early 20th century were trying to do, it's really sort of how can architecture just sort of take one moment of a process and expand it and produce an imagination that other people can then pick up on and run with. So this is looking at, I think I'm just gonna end with that. Yeah, thank you. All right.
Oh, thank you. What a great opening, Mitch. Now, we have Peter, who also has a presentation. So we're going to have to get out of that. You're good on PCs, aren't you, Peter? I'll leave it to you.
No promises.
Okay. Yours is
Actually, I might get Jim to
yours is under
rescue us.
Yours is under there. So now we go from an architect to a lawyer.
Scary transition. Is that you can do that. And I'll just start talking as we're getting the PowerPoint. First, I want to say how important this international frame is, and I'm very supportive of that. I've done a lot of international work, but I'm going to be unapologetically Detroit for now, and really sort of thinking about what has led to the problems that we have. How do you be more inclusive? How do you be more resilient? You have to know what has created the traps that we're in. So a lot of my conversation is going to be how did we get to the mess that we're in, and then given the mess that we're in, what are some radical steps that we might imagine in actually moving us forward. I'm going to talk pretty quickly, but it's actually pretty thematically simple. First, you have to understand what I think about as the geography and the physics of racism, right? And that's sort of be the underlying theme, and we have to know the trap before we're going to be able to transcend this. Then we got to think, how can we transcend the local boundaries that have really entangled us like an octopus and made Detroit an example of what John Powell and other people call spatial racism. Then we're going to think about, since we're not going to be able to change boundaries, although we'd like to change boundaries, if we can't actually change the geopolitical space, how might we imagine layering over different themes of regional revenue sharing to produce greater equity on different dimensions, even if we can't change the boundaries? And then finally, this whole theme about boundaries and drawing and spaces and lines that are geopolitical and imaginary, how do we have to then confront gerrymandering as one of the principal forces that prevent any kind of changes in state policy and state legislation, is yet another form of imagined space that is constraining people, right? So that's the big picture. If we think about Detroit in 1950, what we see is complete ghettoization, right? The green spaces here occupy the black ghettos, right? And so you have ghettoization. The next slide is going to show you population density. And while it's not absolutely clear, that kind of tannish period, right, that is tracking what was the African-American ghetto, an area known as Paradise Valley, is incredibly dense. Right, so dense that if you were to just look at that as an urban planner, you'd be thinking that there is a high rise of multifamily residential housing, right, in that. That's the only thing that gets you that density, unless you're in a black ghetto, right? And what do we know about Detroit? There is no history of high rise residential family housing. That's simply the concentration. Then in your own mind, start to imagine what are the social, political, and economic forces necessary to constrain people in that small spaces, right? And just as a historical note, you see that dark black line, right? Anybody know what that is? Was not there in 1950, right? That dark black line is I-75, right? Which means, and there's a word for this, this is development, right? So development was targeted at the most densely populated part of Detroit, right? And again, that's part of the history. But we're going to see, though, is that these same forces reproduce themselves over time at a regional level. So we had in 1950 complete ghettoization in Detroit. We're going to see the reproduction of that ghettoization at a regional level, and we're going to imagine how these imaginary boundaries of state and city lines are part of that process. So think now about the physics of racism, right? Detroit, is anybody familiar with the story of Ossian Sweet and the Arc of Justice? Right, some hands going up. Black doctor moves into a white neighborhood association forms, sounds pleasant, right? It's like Twilight Zone, calibrated violence in order to violently eject anybody who crosses that color line. Right? So think about that narrative. Detroit neighborhood associations use violence to defend the color line. White flight then accelerates when that violence cannot maintain the sort of integrity of those black ghettos. And we live in Southeast Michigan, one of the most balkanized and segregated and fractured geopolitical spaces. Right? And that's going to be part of the story. But what you have to remember is the new mayor in that town or township, the person who's in the planning commission, are the same people who are part of the neighborhood association. Right? So that intense violent racism doesn't disappear. It simply is spread to a new geopolitical space, and now it has all the privileges of state power. Right? And that's got to be part of the narrative if you're imagining the change that's going from Detroit from the 1920s to the present day. Picture of that region, right? I mean, that's sort of an ugly map. Each one of those is an independent township. Right? And more importantly, in Michigan, you cannot change those boundaries, right? Those boundaries are almost sacrosanct, almost impossible to change, regardless of what is the economic, politics, and racial reality underlying that. All right, switch gears, deep breath, right? We're going to give you an opportunity map of Detroit in present day, right? So think about areas of high opportunity, right? You are living in an area of high opportunity, and Arbor has high opportunity. It has great housing, great employment, great schooling, great health, great transportation, food security, and good living environment. Right? I want to think about all of Southeast Michigan and paint areas of high opportunity in dark, rich colors. So high opportunity, dark, rich colors. Low opportunity, light, pale colors. Right? And we're now going to show what we have in Southeast Michigan, and this is an ugly 7-county subcong map in which Washtenaw is not part of. Those areas of low opportunity, those pale areas, right? I'm going to use the pointer here. This is an opportunity desert. Right? But that opportunity desert has a name. Does anybody know the name of the opportunity desert? Pontiac, right? Poor city in one of the richest counties in America, right? We come down now here, there's another opportunity desert. And what you can see is the almost entire geopolitical boundaries of Detroit. Defined, if you're from outer space and could look down and only see opportunity, you would see Detroit as an opportunity desert, right? And yet we live in an opportunity-rich region, right? So start thinking about that. I'm going to overlay in the next slide, and this is coming out of the Kirwan Institute's work, so I want to give proper credit. Green dots to represent the African-American population, right? And I'm going to toggle that a little bit so you sort of see the reality here, right? And we got to call things by their true name, right? What John Powell and others call this is spatial racism, right? So we have the complete segregation in Southeast Michigan of opportunity, of wealth, and of race. Right? And now that's the backdrop we have to ask ourselves, how do we get a more inclusive, resilient society? Those are the prisons that we've gotten. But think about how that affects every social policy issue you care about, whether it's social work, whether it's planning, whether it's architecture, whether it's law, whether it's civil rights. Affects everything, right? In a matter of life and death, right? Didn't have to be that way, right? It is there largely because of the inability to move boundaries. Right? So what you have here, in Detroit, you have cities inside of cities to show you the insanity of not being able to annex land. Right? A different model would be Charlotte, North Carolina, right? A place where they call it elastic boundaries. If you were in Charlotte and things start to change in terms of population and politics, you simply grow the city. Right? And there's a logic to that we teach in law school, that the scope of the regulatory unit has to map onto the scope of the regulatory problem. And when there's a mismatch, there's going to be predictable externalities and difficulties, right? So the next map shows the growth of Detroit post-World War II in the greenish colors onward, right? Didn't used to be that big, right? And think about how large that has gotten. Think about the geography, the space that that is all eating up, and think about how recent that is, right? This is not ancient history, this is recent history. The next slide is going to show Charlotte, right? A little bit different scale, so it's not completely things you can overlay, but as Charlotte grew, the boundaries grew, right? And you see that little black dot in the middle? That's old city Charlotte, right? The wider areas of Charlotte before 1950. All of that growth, an increase in size of over 7-fold, happened at the same time Detroit became spatially racialized. The geopolitical unit of Charlotte had to deal with all of each other, right? So think about it. White flight, you run, right? You get annexed. You run, you get annexed, right? So you can run, but you cannot hide. And it changes the very definition of community and the very scope of what we have as a unit to be dealing with. And in Detroit, remember the sort of notion of spatial racism. So the question I sort of entertain here with is, what would the geography and politics of Southeast Michigan be like, right, if Detroit's boundary had changed since 1950 in the same way that Charlotte's had? Right? Radically different idea what the polity is, what the community is, what the city is. And I would argue that we'd have a very different set of social, still have problems, right? Nothing's utopian, nothing goes away, but we have a very different set of skills and tools to work with in terms of dealing with those sets of problems. All right, we can't change boundaries, right? Or maybe we can, but we're going to need a whole lot of different state legislation before we could do that. What if we could try to get regional revenue sharing, right? And this is, again, sort of the last best opportunity that was not taken. Lack of any regional consciousness. Right? We don't think of ourselves as a region. We don't think of ourselves as a community. And Detroit Future City is one of the best examples of that. And I'll give another counterfactual, how we could have used the bankruptcy process to get an implicit regional revenue sharing through the water system. Right? But again, nobody wants to do that, the sort of notion of not having any commitment to it. So the story, right? This is regionalism from the perspective of Detroit Future City, which is an effort to plan the city for the next 50 years. Right? 360-page report. Almost every map in that entire report views Detroit in isolation, right? And this is not just sort of cherry picking, right? There's no Macomb County, there's no Oakland County, there's no Dearborn, there's no Grosse Pointe, there's no downriver. Complete isolation. And if you remember the opportunity map, we're viewing Detroit as an opportunity desert in isolation, right? And now we're making economic choices of social triage driven by a logic of isolation and a logic of the absence of resources. Now, it's not like these are not smart people, right? In the same document, they know that the watershed is more than that geopolitical space, right? That these are imaginary boundaries that we impose upon people. They know that bird patterns do not follow city boundaries, right? And imagine geopolitical space. But even in the Detroit Future City document, you find the Detroit Water Sewer Department as an entity, regulatory entity, that is massive in scope and is much bigger than Detroit. And here's a couple of other pictures, not from the report, that sort of give you the idea of how large that is. And it starts to merge in different ways with that larger regional map that we had, right? So this was the thought experiment, and I say this with all due respect to Judge Rosen. Why no grander bargain, right? What we could have done is actually take the Detroit Water Sewage Department through the bankruptcy process and had an implicit regional revenue sharing system, right? What you would have to do is break contracts, renegotiate contracts to maximize revenue for the holder of the asset, something indeed you're supposed to do in bankruptcy, and yet we didn't do it, right? We did it for the pensioners, we did it for the bondholders, but we would not do it for the form of regional revenue sharing that would address the inequities that's happening in the city of Detroit and the larger region. Right? We kind of left with that political impasse, that political problem of why we didn't get that done. What we did instead is maintain a new Great Lakes Water Authority that views each one of those geopolitical fractured entities as its own unit of analysis and doesn't allow any cross-subsidy. Right? So that means you have Detroit and the Opportunity Desert with a spiraling out of control set of rate structures, some of the highest endemic poverty levels. So rather than regional revenue sharing, what we're getting is tens of thousands of water shutoffs a year, right? Predictably result of that systemic inequality underlying that sort of regional inequity that I alluded to earlier, right? And it's not alone, right? That water spiral is the same spiral with auto insurance. Right, it's the same spiral with the collapse of the municipal tax base. It's the same spiral that's happening with the tax foreclosures that was alluded to in the auctions with the last talk. So, how might we go forward? Right, each one of these changes require changes in state legislation. Right, so now we have to think about the state as the unit and think about how state politics works out. And what you may not know, or you may know, is that in Michigan in the last general election, there were more Democratic votes cast than Republican votes, and yet we have supermajority Republican House and Senate, right? So it's the gerrymandering, right? It's the political boundaries for state representation, for federal representation, that is one of the primary obstacles. And you sort of see the themes coming through here, these imaginary boundaries that we draw on these maps that are actually imprisoning entire populations, and they have to be challenged. So the last map I will leave you with is actually the congressional districts, right? In the rest of the state, big sort of squares, right? Come down to southeast Michigan, come down to Detroit, which is on the left side for you, and you have, again, these crazy boundaries being drawn, right? Which are carving up communities, right? Disempowering and disenfranchising folks. But that's the kind of challenge afoot. So if you're asking how do you get more inclusive, resilient communities, we have to start questioning very seriously those imaginary boundaries that we put on maps. And we have to understand the effects that has historically, and we have to be more self-conscious about erasing those, at least in terms of the consequences that we have, if we want to have more inclusive and more resilient cities. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jess. Can you, he doesn't have a presentation.
Great.
Well, thank you. Now we're going to move on. What a wonderful dense. I think the architect should be talking to the to the legal one. So now we're going to deal with education and David Scobey, who you can all read the name.
Hi, I'm a historian by training, an urban and cultural historian. And if you put that fact together with my age, you'll know that I don't use PowerPoint in very interesting ways. So I'm just going to give you what's really a pitch for a certain theme, a certain kind of intervention on behalf of inclusive urbanism, which is that the Metro Detroit region, and I think you're making me think, Peter, about the regionalist kind of logic of what I'm about to say, needs to develop creative, transformative new ways of offering college opportunities for adult, non-traditional students. I taught for many years in the College of Architecture and Urban Planning, did a lot of community partnership work at Michigan and elsewhere, and ended up being a dean and an academic administrator in a division at the New School in New York that taught adult undergraduates. And you'll find all of that history in this idea. Because what I'm going to propose is that provisioning new forms of higher education for adult students is also an important practice of community building, if done right, and of inclusive urbanism, if done right. So first of all, the problem. At a national scale, adult, non-traditional undergraduates who are not recent high schoolers financially dependent on their parents attending 2- or 4-year institutions full-time are the large majority of American college goers. Half of all college students are financially independent of their childhood families. More than half work more than half time. 1/3 of all college students work full time. About 45% study part time. A similar number are older than age 24. All in all, only about 1 in 4 college students are traditional undergraduates, and that's almost exactly the same proportion as college students who are parents. So the landscape of college going is not only, and everything I've just told you is the result of complicated processes that have especially heated up in the last 30 or 40 years. Our picture of what college students are like is utterly at odds with this, which means that this new non-traditional majority are invisible. Both educational design practices and higher ed policies in institutions and nationally marginalize them. These students confront a higher ed landscape designed for other people. And as a result, they fail or stop out or go into debt at much higher levels. There are many causes to this, and I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but just to kind of flash the headlines, over the past 30 years, the decline in high-wage industrial jobs and the emergence of jobs for which some kind of post-secondary training is more necessary, balanced by enormous public disinvestment that fueled rising tuition and rising student debt levels in the last 20 or 30 years. And all of that together, and that could be unpacked more, created this paradox in which there were genuine incentives to democratize, to expand access to college, and all kinds of barriers to success for students who then have to drop out, have to delay, have to defer. That's what's behind these statistics that I started with. One result is that profile of college students that I just gave you. Another result is that there's a huge number, nationally we think about 37 to 40 million Americans who have some college credits already, but no degree, and who are hobbled economically and personally by being stuck in this system. And I hope you can hear the resonances with changes in Southeast Michigan. A recent study said that in Southeast Michigan, in the 8-county region of Detroit and the surroundings, there are about 150,000 people between the age of 25 and 35 with that some credits, no degree status. So there's an enormous languishing human community in the region. We know that giving them great, engaged, transformative college opportunities is really important for their economic security, but also for their personal transformation and for the kind of community social capital that higher education can bring. We know from especially a national venture called the Talent Dividend by CEOs for Cities that raising the attainment rate of college by 1% adds an enormous amount to the regional income of a community. The one estimate in the Detroit region is that a 1% increase in college attainment would bring in $3.4 billion more in annual personal income. So my pitch is that we have to find ways of redesigning opportunities for this adult non-traditional majority in the Detroit region, but it's equally how we do that. Because the ways that most policy makers now are responding to that are flat and instrumental and unhelpful. It involves workforce training that places individualized, disembedded students, often in front of computer screens, to give them a first job that somehow corresponds to the current snapshot of the labor market. It's not even good as economic policy, much less as community building policy or policy of personal emancipation. It's a vision of education that doesn't understand that even more than traditional college students, traditional age college students, this adult non-traditional majority needs to find educational opportunities in its communities with peer support from its communities, and that these students have enormous amounts of social capital and personal experience that can fuel great education if we design college education to take advantage of them. So this means that thinking about this issue isn't just a matter of provisioning opportunity or of having higher Pell Grants or of bringing more students into the campuses that we have. It's an educational redesign project, which is also a community building project. It means that higher ed institutions, and I think both four-year universities and community colleges, have to practice in new ways, have to develop new geographies and new temporalities of how people gain access to education. They have to imagine themselves not as drawing underserved people into their campuses, but going out into a regional geography of community learning centers that builds on the social networks and community capital, that the community relationships that people have, that offers credit-bearing, educationally rich opportunities grounded in people's own work and community and family experiences. And that, to go back to Peter's vision, metropolitanizes, creates a networked landscape of opportunities that both creates communities and peer support for people's learning, as well as opportunities for financial support and mentoring and other things that adult students need. And one last point, to do that, one cannot develop that project of educational design, of providing a community geography for this majority of adult learners without practicing the values that Anna first developed us to. This is a project of listening, of building trust, of democratic, collaborative, educational design that requires higher ed institutions to be partners in a new way with regional communities.
Thank you. All right, so this is very interesting. So now I think Mary is our next speaker. Mary, you're without images too, right? Yes.
I do not have a PowerPoint, mainly because I'm just lazy, guys. So didn't have it together.
No, not at all.
Thank you. So labels kind of fascinate me, and when Anna referred to me as a civic activist, I thought, I need to think about that. I think of myself as a reformed journalist more than anything else, and so maybe I'm transitioning. So I spent my first career in journalism. I was a business reporter and business editor and then opinion editor locally for the Ann Arbor News. I became very disenchanted with the publication and the owners and the direction that we were going as a profession. And in general, I think of things as large problems that are overwhelming. How can I look at them in ways that are small enough that I think I can address and try to solve in a much more contained way? And so for the journalistic piece of that, I quit my job at the Ann Arbor News and started a publication called the Ann Arbor Chronicle, which was online only, focused on covering local government. It was very intense. We covered not just the main government bodies, but also the Planning Commission and the Park Commission and the Library Board. And we covered them in a very deep way and built a reputation over 6 years of being the go-to source for that piece. But it took a toll on us. We became pretty exhausted during that period and decided that rather than change what we were doing to become something that we were less proud of, we would stop in a planful way and reflect on what we'd done and talk about what we wanted to do next. And when I say we, I did this in partnership with my husband, who was editor of the Ann Arbor Chronicle, and I was publisher during those 6 years. And we didn't kill each other during that time, which I chalk up to something that I have no control over, I think. So as we reflected on what we did with the Chronicle, really outreach and education was not part of our mission. But over the years, we became increasingly frustrated because while we were providing a community resource, the piece of the community that was actually interested in that resource, namely local government and local civic life, was actually very small. So we had a readership each month of about 30 or 40,000 people. Some of those were outside of the community. But, you know, if you look at the population of the county or even Ann Arbor, closer to 100,000, it was really only a fraction of the people that we were reaching in any given month. You would go out in the community and be very interested in what was happening at the city council and things that were being deliberated on that were going to impact our lives as residents. And 9 times out of 10, the people you talk to would have absolutely no idea what you were talking about. Didn't know the decision makers, didn't know the issues. Ann Arbor likes to think of itself as a very informed community, but a lot of that is outward, so you can have conversant people who are conversant on international topics and national topics, even state-level topics. But where you are and where you're able to influence, actually, in a much deeper way, people really have far less attention, pay far less attention to what happens in their community in that regard. So you end up having a very small number of people who are very influential and making decisions that impact the rest of us simply because, you know, we don't care, we've got our attention turned to other things. And it's always puzzled me, in part because I like to see how systems work. It's puzzled me that people in the community where they live oftentimes that's the last place that they turn to get informed and educated and motivated to get involved. So this sort of fits into the broader context of our national level discourse, political discourse, which is very toxic. It's becoming increasingly polarized. And I was trying to fit in my framework, how can you take a shot at fixing that or transforming that culture into a more productive culture. And again, I take large problems and look at how I can bite them off locally in a way that I can make an impact. And so sort of thinking about these things led me to wonder whether you could take a city like Ann Arbor, which is still relatively small, and use it as a test bed, proof of concept, for completely changing the way we look at ourselves, not as consumers, but as citizens, changing our relationship with the local government that we elect, with the people who are making the decisions in our community, with the citizens who live next to us, our neighbors, people who are involved in their own world but don't necessarily intersect with your own life. So what that all led to was the creation of a nonprofit called the Civ City Initiative. We are trying to transform the culture of Ann Arbor to make it a culture that is infused with opportunities to get informed, educated, and involved in civic life. So I want you to imagine a world where, for example, you didn't know what Coke was, or you didn't know what the Block M was. That's kind of where we are when we talk about our local government and civic life. Most people don't have any frame of reference. They sort of know that there's a city council, or they might know that there's a county board of commissioners making decisions, but their understanding of the process and their understanding of who's making those decisions and their understanding of how they can participate is very scant. So we're working to transform that so that everybody you meet, your neighbors, in your workplace, your places of worship, where you go shopping, is working from a base level of civic literacy that is something you can assume other people have as well. So you're not going to, I say we're fighting civic apathy, but we're really trying to create a community that has a baseline civic literacy unlike any other community in America. Developing tools, saturating the community, working with other partners to achieve this goal. I want you to be able to come to Ann Arbor as a new resident and be blown away by what you see, by the fact that everybody knows what the issues are before City Council, that everybody has an opinion about them and it's informed opinion, that everybody is fully aware of the candidates who are running for local office, whether it's in the judicial races or for the library board or school board or city council, that everyone has a sense of their own responsibility at this point in their life with their community. So for example, if you've got a lot of other things going on in your life, maybe your contribution is cleaning out the storm drain so that the civic infrastructure of our storm sewer system, you know, is a little bit better because of the work that you did. On the other end of the spectrum, running for a local office, asking to be appointed and going through the appointment process for an advisory board. So there's a spectrum of involvement, and I want everybody in this community to have an understanding of what those opportunities are and how they can plug into them at different points in their life. To give you some examples, when I talk about saturating the community, what I really mean is when you walk through your daily routine. So when you are going to school, going to work, going to a shopping center, going to a sporting venue, you encounter some kind of sign, some kind of touchstone of your local government and your local civics. So for example, I want to build, in partnership with a group called Festifools, a huge Citizen Ann Arbor puppet that we can deploy to pass out voter registration information or information about local elections, that we can just take out to Costco or the Michigan football stadium, places where people already are doing something else. We're not asking them to come to City Hall. We're not asking them to come to a particular public forum. We're going out to them. Every coffee shop has a sign that says, these are the top 5 issues at City Council this week. There's a sign in the library that says, here's how Ann Arbor works, and gives you basically a graphic of the different elected bodies and what their responsibilities are. We're working with Washtenaw Literacy to develop a newsletter for low literacy adults who can get, who don't have access to information in the same way that a lot of us do, that they can get that information where they live. They can get it working through Washtenaw Literacy Tutors, but also in housing complexes and food pantries and places where they're already going for other purposes. We're really looking for ways that we can insert ourselves into the existing fabric of the community and create a sense of place that connects individuals in a commonality of their citizenship in this country and their residency in this community. And I would encourage you, part of what I feel like I've been doing for the past year since we incorporated is planting seeds to ask people individually and with the organizations that they work with, how might you affect this kind of change? How might you take a leadership role in making the sort of civic literacy something that's top of mind, starting in your local place wherever you live, whether it's Ann Arbor or elsewhere, and then expanding out to the state and the nation. Thanks.
Well, we're coming up to our last speaker, and then you're all going to have a turn. So I'd like to welcome Andy Newman, who I know has a bit of a voice challenge.
We'll see.
But Andy is an anthropologist, if you've all consulted your sheets, who works in Detroit, who carried out his PhD research with immigrants in Paris, and so came to Detroit, I imagine, with a great deal of knowledge and experience.
Okay, I'm hoping my voice will hold out for 9 minutes. Apologize if it's a little too grating on your ears. I have this residual of this cold that everybody around here seems to have gotten. So I guess to think about inclusive, resilient cities, the place to begin is probably to rethink the kind of taken for granted assumptions that have informed policy up until now, and that are in many ways responsible for the picture you see right here, which is not a new picture. This map is from recent census data, but this is a story that's kind of old news now in terms of forces about shaping segregation. And what I want to talk a little bit about today are, on one hand, the production of knowledge about cities, how we know what we know about cities, and how that knowledge shapes dominant approaches to urban policy and urban revitalization. the kind of dominant definition of urban revitalization in Michigan cities and Detroit is a relatively old one that comes from the early 80s, which is the idea of the post-industrial city reinvented its tourist destination. And of course, tourism doesn't just necessarily mean people from all over the country, all over the world. It can also mean people from the region. And this is what makes possible a notion that, opening up a restaurant in like a cool old building equals urban revitalization. And this is within, of course, the kind of journalistic media depictions of Detroit, the kind of dominant way of talking about the city. And I want to think about, for a few minutes, ways to shift those definitions of knowledge about the city, about what urban revitalization is, and think about other visions of how to remake a city. Actually, sometimes new ideas are needed, sometimes old ideas actually work really well too. It was Jane Jacobs in her 1961, was it, book, The Life and Death of American Cities, who had this great quote, it could have come from today, where she talks about how experts have this tendency to constantly search their minds for new ways to attract the middle class to the cities, when in fact what we should be thinking about is how cities can be ways to produce and reproduce a middle class, right? And that side, that whole old notion of the city as a kind of instrument of social mobility has often been left aside and just forgotten in a lot of the current debates. And so if you want to start at it from that angle, a kind of Jacobsian angle of thinking about the city, then it forces you then to think about the neighborhood and the kind of vision of the total neighborhood. What are the infrastructures required to sustain life in a neighborhood? And if you think about inclusiveness in a city, of course, given the map you see it right here, and of course the political history of Michigan, we often think about that in terms of race and sort of anti-racism. But there are other ways that map onto this that sometimes might even make racial divisions more visible and more changeable. What if we think about, for example, intergenerational makeup of cities, which is extremely important in Detroit. And if you look at the fact that the dominant paradigm for revitalizing cities, particularly in Detroit and other Michigan cities, focuses on the notion of creatives and the sort of creative class as a kind of group to sort of revitalize cities. In that framework, the agent, the person that all the consultants come and talk about, this is how you attract to the city, these are the kinds of businesses you want to open, is predominantly the single, detached from larger kinship networks, detached from larger communities, sort of agent of a person who could, go back and forth between different cities, a kind of individual who could work at companies in different places, this kind of dominant, I guess, kind of corporate citizen of our day and time, which is in some ways quite disconnected from the experience and lived everyday life in working class, blue collar communities across Southeast Michigan, and particularly in Detroit itself. And so if you want to start thinking about the city as a kind of life support system that reproduces, as a kind of city as an instrument of social reproduction, we can start thinking about cities in a broader urban revitalization in a broader sense, right, that looks at parks, looks at schools, looks at infrastructure in a broad way as not simply providing water and energy and so on, but as sort of a part of an overall life support system for the city. Within my work at Wayne State, I've become really fascinated actually by this problem that affects a lot of social science research, and Mitch mentioned it early on, this kind of gap between the producers of knowledge about the city and those who are in the city and those who inhabit the city. And I sort of stumbled into this project shortly after coming to Wayne State. It came about as, in some ways, as a moment of self-critique of my own work, my past work as an ethnographer in France. My entry point within the communities I studied had always been, first and foremost, as an ethnographer. And that always put me, and I think as a lot of ethnographers have written about in the literature, to quite a bit of unease in terms of the power relationships and so on that has in relationships to where we work. And so shortly after working at Wayne State, I just hung out, went to meetings. I was interested first because I'd heard as an outsider, as many outsiders do, kind of urban ag in the city. So I went to kind of food justice meetings and so on, and sort of organically fell into a project. And it's kind of a funny thing. Anthropologists are used to showing up in a city and saying, I have this project that I'm doing. Would you be interested in participating in my research? And I kind of found myself pulled in the opposite direction. Oh, you're an anthropologist? Why don't you go over to this? Let's talk about this. And so originally, the start was me meeting someone named Linda Campbell, whose background is in public health and who works in an organization called Building Movement Detroit. And I met her and a geographer named Sarah Safransky, who was also doing research in Detroit. We began a project that started off in some ways as a directory of social justice organizations, which was to satisfy her relatively short-term goals for a grant that she was working on. And so we'd go to different organizations and talk about what the definition of social justice was, what does a social justice organization look like, how does that map onto the missions of not-for-profits. And I thought, lo and behold, people started saying, well, maybe you should make some maps, or maybe we should talk about people doing maps, maybe we should think about something bigger. Suddenly people started talking about this crazy idea of an atlas of Detroit based on this kind of thing. And so this project became a project called Detroit People's Atlas, which is now reaching a point where we're in the process, in the sort of publication process right now with the press. And we're excited about it coming out. Our work is based on actually a tradition of radical geography and radical urban studies that has a relatively Wayne State-centered history. In the late 60s, there was a geography professor named Bill Bunge, or William Bunge. I don't know if anyone ever heard of this work. He wrote a book called Fitzgerald as a part of a collaboration called the Detroit Geography Expedition, in which he held classes, sort of teach-ins around the city, and started thinking about alternative ways to map the city. And the maps they created were in some ways just sort of the residue of a much broader kind of collaborative, educative model actually within the city. The project was, from a publication point of view, short-lived, although it went on to inform an entire movement within called counter-geography, an entire wing of human geography later on. And so we're sort of speaking to that tradition in Detroit with our project. And what we did is essentially held mapping workshops around the city and started drawing different types of maps. We started the discussions with a map, this map, and actually asked, what questions does this map raise? When you see this map, what are you confronted with? It is, after all, a very jarring map. If you're if you're very familiar with the area, it's not terribly surprising, but it is very jarring to see nonetheless. If you superimpose this map on it, you start to think about what foreclosure means. You can really start to see the way inequality operates and is reproduced, particularly because we often think of foreclosure, for example, as a loss of property. Like, that's typically how I think about it. But foreclosure is also the accumulation of capital as well, particularly by banks and so on, and a retaining of property for future use, of course. And so sometimes we see maps, for example, with Detroit Future Cities and other sources that talk about a lack of economic activity in many neighborhoods in Detroit. But actually, you can look at the foreclosure crisis in some ways as precisely a form of economic activity. It just doesn't necessarily benefit the community, right? And so this forces us to really think about the ways we define things like economic activity, like neighborhoods with vibrant markets versus neighborhoods with distressed markets. And out of this kind of collaborative process, a series of maps begin to be generated, which I'm just going to show some quick hand-drawn versions. I don't know if you can see them very well. They don't translate well to the PowerPoint format. It's actually a very interesting thing when people sit down and draw maps. In the practice, they're a product of interactions and the kind of really great live interchange in a classroom. And that's a whole form of knowledge production that's actually separate from what I'm doing right now, quite distinct from it, right? So it actually doesn't translate well to this format. But what people begin to think about are places of value in the city that are valued in ways that are not the traditional way of defining valuable land, right? The question of what is valuable land and what is valuable space becomes really important. I don't know if you can read a lot of these little things. First, this is a really disorienting kind of map, and this comes from the fact that, so within these workshops, we held 5 of them in different neighborhoods around the city. We were interested in the redistricting of Detroit that was going on at this time. New city council districts that were formed. And that provided the framework for a lot of our map making, because the city council district, of course, provides access to participation in a political process. And so these are both maps of District 5. And of course, they're tipped upside down and tipped in lots of different ways. It's probably really hard to get a point of reference. This is actually Bell Island is at the top of that map. So it's kind of Detroit upside down. And people spin them around to write on them. The other one is actually looking basically north across the sort of northeast across the M10. But what people like to value, what they like to write about, are just spaces people hang out, spaces where everyday life takes place. And I think that was one thing that, I'm summarizing a lot here in a short time, but one of the profound lessons that I learned in this project was actually so much of the rhetoric about Detroit is sensationalist, apocalyptic, Hollywood-esque. But the reality of life in these spaces is that these are the spaces of people's everyday lives, and in some ways, reminding people of the banality in some ways. And the lived everyday texture of life in these spaces is actually becomes very important because it helps to humanize experience. And so we were trying to think, is there some way that mapping can be humanizing? Often it has the opposite effect. The other thing I want to talk about was the importance of common spaces, and a couple of comments have been made so far about public spaces, different types of publics in the city. We've been very interested in, first of all, the definitions behind public and private, and the difficulties that lie behind them. They can mean lots of different things. Many people I've talked to in Detroit, and it's kind of funny because you read it, geography journals, anthropology journals, you hear people talking about commons. So you think of this language as kind of ivory tower, and run into people in neighborhoods and they talk about commons too. And it's kind of an interesting convergence, right? Not necessarily the same idea sometimes. And so what we've been interested in this project is mapping commons, mapping places of potential, places of creativity. And again, I started off as being critical of the kind of creative class argument about cities, but actually that doesn't mean that I think the core of any kind of urban revitalization strategy is about creativity, but it's the latent creativity that is within cities. And I think it's the task, when you talk about the politics of representing cities, is to seek to uncover creativity within cities, what people are doing, as opposed to import it from the outside. And it's, in some ways, what I'm talking about is kind of old news for anthropologists, which is the definitions that people have on the ground are not necessarily the same that the so-called experts bring to the table. But I think that old lesson is needs to be learned, unfortunately, again and again, especially in the example of Detroit and in the example of inclusion and resilience in Detroit. So, thank you.